Hey everyone, Clio here, and today I'm giving you a look at my maybe shelf. So if you've been following this cleanup project, you would know that this is the fourth video in this point in time in this series, and if I could go back I would definitely redo some things, which is what I'm currently doing actually, because I am refilming the introduction shot and the end shot for this video because they were completely out of focus. And I will say that if it weren't for the fact that this video is part of a series, I would probably not have posted it, because there's this weird whistle whiny tone at the background of most of the shots that you will get after this introduction shot. Plus I wasn't fully in focus, so I'm not entirely proud of this one, but I did want to show you guys my process with this list of books. So the cleanup process has been a big part project, so I am trying to reduce the amount of unread books on these shelves, and so in part that has happened through reading throughout the year, in part it will happen like that as well next year and the year after probably as well. But what I'm also doing is taking a hard look at these shelves at this point in time and trying to decide, okay, which one of these do I really still want to read and which ones maybe perhaps I'm not that interested in anymore. And so this is the fourth video in the series in which I've taken a look at some of the books that I wanted to get rid of or that I was unsure about, and I've kind of made a list of all of those, compared certain criteria, set up certain parameters, and based off of that I have a couple of books here now that I'm going to be doing a try a chapter tag with. So throughout the clips you will get later on, you'll see me going through these individually and then deciding for them. So the books that I have is Great Short Works of Herman Melville, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, Wings of the Dove by Henry James, The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, The New York Trilogy by Paul Auster, Kraken by China Melville, and Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. But so without further ado, let's dive into the crappy video that I have for you guys and let's see what I ended up deciding. Past Clio here taking over. So I have this pile next to me and I'm gonna go through them. I don't know whether I want to go through them in a particular order. You know, what would be best? Like biting the bullets and doing reading one that I'm not excited about first, or let's do that. Let's take up the one that I'm least excited about in this entire pile, and that would be Great Short Works of Herman Melville. So Herman Melville is the author of Moby Dick, which is a book that I read years ago. I read it when I was still in university. I read it for myself during my holidays, and you know, I read it mainly on the train when I was going to my summer job, and I remember falling asleep on the train a lot, and I'm very excited about the fact that I never actually missed my train stop, which is something that I did do when I was a teacher. But I did not have a good experience with Moby Dick. I think it was way too long, it was boring, there were so many things in there that I just didn't see why they were included or who would want to see them included. Especially because, you know, I went into it thinking it's like one of the great American novels and I was just bored for a lot of it. But so I have this on my shelf. I actually bought this after Moby Dick. Don't ask me why I do this to myself. But so this is a collection of short stories by him, and apparently I thought that maybe I should give him a second chance. So I'll just be going through this one. I'll always try to read out part of it. This one actually starts with an introduction, so maybe that's also a good thing to do. The Town Host Story as told at the Golden Inn. Note: the Town Host Story appeared first in Harper's New Monthly Magazine for October 1851, where it was presented as an excerpt from The Whale, a new work by Mr. Melville in the press of Harper and Brothers, and now publishing in London by Mr. Bentley. The same. So the same issue coincidentally featured an account of an incident during the Mutiny of 1797. That near-revolutionary episode characteristic of a time I can already not follow this. Whatever, let's skip this paragraph. As a self-contained tale of adventure and Melville's first published work in this popular mode, the story is proof positive of its author's casual virtuosity in the art of narrative. We'll see. Alright guys, I think my conclusion, I haven't even finished this story, my conclusion is I cannot do it. Moby Dick's, Herman Melville's writing style just isn't for me, you know. I think if I get a sort of like redacted version of his stories, I would like it. There are definitely certain parts about it that I like when we're really going into the action and things like that, but he just has a tendency to put so much description in there, and to go on these sort of like side tangents where you're just describing the ship, the world, the places that they're visiting. So even though we've only had like one occurrence of this is already annoying me. And that is basically my experience with Moby Dick as well. With Moby Dick, I've always said I could summarize that story in like what, 10 pages and you would still have the same story. And yes, granted that it definitely could be longer than 10 pages and still be a good book. There was just so much extra material in there that frustrated me to no end. So for the sake of my own sanity, I'm going to put down short stories of Herman Melville. This is getting unhauled as well. So next up I'm going to be, what am I going to be trying? I'm going to be trying Wings of the Dove by Henry James. So I initially thought that I hadn't read a Henry James when I was going through my bookshelves and seeing two of his works, but I actually have read one. I have read Washington Square. Don't really remember too much about it, but I do think it was like a pleasant experience in any case. But I think I'm going to be quite exigent for these books. I'm going to demand them to be more than just fine or more than just okay. So we'll see what ends up happening with this one. So Wings of the Dove by Henry James is: The Wings of the Dove is a tale of desire and possession, of love and death. It is in essence a simple story, but one that opens up the great subject of art, life itself. To tackle this, James moves between fairy tale storylines and the startlingly modern techniques of his testing late style. An unspeakable subtext lies beneath the silence. Distinct points of view and different centers of consciousness betray the dislocation of the social facade from the desolation beneath. For all the familiar signs, there is a gulf between glamour and the underlying dread of loss. The eternal triangle of romance is played out here like a game on an international stage for the very highest stake. It centers on the dying girl who wants to live and love, but those closest to her are in competition for what she can leave behind. Millie Teal, the heiress of the ages, is imagined as a dove, a princess, a Renaissance beauty, but these symbols come at a dreadful cost. By the end of the novel we know we shall never be again as we were. So like the back explanation for this book says absolutely nothing. It's basically just like talking about the thematic of this book. It doesn't really say anything about the content of it. And like, yeah, I'm not going to read the introduction for this one. I'm going to just go straight into the story. Nor am I going to the author's preface. Ow, it's a long author's preface. Yeah. So let's go into book the first. And you know, I don't know whether it's just today, whether I'm just unable to kind of focus on these things because I'm also reading Rhythm of War at the moment and I would rather be reading that, but I find myself being extremely strict and saying no to this one. I think there are more interesting classics for me to hang on to, and that I'm gonna let go of this one. Next up, what are we gonna try? Next I'm gonna try a non-fiction. This is the only non-fiction that I have on here, and in principle I want to keep it, but on the other hand I also think that I probably will never read it, and so I definitely want to see if maybe the writing style is like a lot better than I am like expecting it to be, or a lot more engaging, and so maybe I do want to read it in that case. And that is Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley, which is a biography of Jane Austen. This is a book that was published at the time of the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's death. And so let me just read out the back for you guys. So on the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's death, historian Lucy Worsley leads us into the rooms from which our best-loved novelist quietly changed the world. This new telling of the story of Jane's life shows us how and why she lived as she did, examining the places and spaces that mattered to her. It wasn't all country houses and ballrooms, but a life that was often a painful struggle. Jane famously lived a life without incident, but with new research and insights, Lucy Worsley reveals a passionate woman who fought for her freedom, a woman who, far from being a lonely spinster, in fact had at least 5 marriage prospects, but who in the end refused to settle for anything less than Mr. Darcy. We'll see. So I'm going to be reading the sort of like first chapter for this one, and then figuring out whether I like it or not. I don't know. I think it's interesting to look at the story of Jane Austen told through the like spaces that she inhabited. But I think there's not enough of an interest there for me to have actually picked this book up actively. So I think I definitely want to try it out now to see whether there's something there for me to like get drawn into. So I want to choose out a passage here that I've just stumbled upon and I think will be interesting for you guys to read as well. So it's not the passage I'm talking about. Young people reading Jane Austen for the first time think that the stories are about love and romance and finding a partner. But a happy home is equally as much what all of her heroines don't have and yet desire. All of Jane's leading ladies are displaced from either their physical home or from their family. Jane shows subtly but devastatingly how hard it is to find a true home, a place of safety in which one can be understood and loved. She is uniquely sensitive to a particular home's happiness or unhappiness. This has led people to assume that Jane herself was unhappy at home, flawed or damaged in some way, but the depressing fact is that she was just one among many spinsters of her time and position in society who had to try to feel at home in unusual, meager or unpleasant places. And it wasn't just spinsters. I cannot help feeling a great desire to be at home, however uncomfortable that home may be, wrote Jane's sister-in-law, Fanny. Home to her was a cramped cabin on board her sailor's husband's ship. And so Jane's novels are full of homes loved, lost, lusted after. In her first published work, Sense and Sensibility, it is a death in the family that forces Eleanor and Marianne out of their childhood home. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters will be expelled from their home at the end of her father's life. Fanny Price is sent away from her home, like one of Jane's own brothers, to live with richer relations at Mansfield Park. And Elliot misses her country life at Kellynch Hall when packed off in Persuasion to Bath. Even Catherine Morland of Northanger Abbey and Emma Woodhouse of Emma, young, relatively well off and in no immediate danger of homelessness, have to choose their future domestic setups wisely. So I've gone through the sort of introduction to this to this non-fiction work, and I think I'm intrigued. I definitely do want to keep it around for a little bit longer, because I've never really personally interpreted any of Jane Austen's work in the way that was introduced here, the way that I also read out to you, as being like a search for a steady home situation. And the introduction also very much talks about, it's very much frank about the way that biographers will have their own interpretation to Jane. So she's also saying how Jane's life has been reinterpreted many times again. People have always found in her the example of what they want to find in her. So like in the Victorian era, they would see her as a sort of pristine personage, whereas in more modern days, people are trying to find, you know, the role model of a badass feminist in her. And so it's just very open about those things, and I'm very much liking, you know, the way that she's approaching this subject within her introduction in any case. So I do definitely think that I do want to dive into it a little bit more and see what she has uncovered about Jane Austen, and kind of maybe see her books in a different light as well, because I have read all of Jane Austen's works and I absolutely love Jane Austen's works, but I wouldn't mind going into it a little bit more and going into the person of Jane Austen herself a little bit more as well. So I'm going to keep it around. It is a non-fiction, so it actually does not count for my physical TBR, because I don't really put non-fictions on my TBR, though actually I do have 2 non-fictions on there, so maybe I should remove them as well from my physical count. Would be exciting. So yeah, I'm going to be keeping this one. It wasn't actually counting for my physical TBR, because I don't really tend to count non-fiction works for my physical TBR, but I of course wanted to make sure that I also wasn't keeping a sort of non-fiction that I had no intention of ever reading. So I do think that I'm going to be keeping, as this one is sticking around for the moment. Next for me to try will be the New York Trilogy by Paul Auster. So I have actually already read the first book within this trilogy, but I'm actually going to be rereading one of those chapters to see whether I want to continue, because I don't really remember. I think it has quite a sort of like modernist style to it, if I remember correctly. I also read the sort of like graphic novel version of this, which works very interestingly alongside the text. But so the first book in this series is City of Glass, and so it says, as a result of a strange phone call in the middle of the night, Quinn, a writer of detective stories, becomes enmeshed in a case more puzzling than any he might have written. Yeah. It does ring a bell, but I don't really know too much about it anymore. But so let me dive into not the introduction, but City of Glass, the first book. Well, I even underlined things in this because I did do a paper on the sort of adaptation from the original story into the graphic novel for this one. It was a wrong number that started it, the telephone ringing 3 times in the dead of night, and the voice on the other end asking for someone he was not. Much later, when he was able to think about the things that happened to him, he would conclude that nothing was real except chance. But that was much later. In the beginning, there was simply the event and its consequences. Whether it might have turned out differently, or whether it was all predetermined with the first word that came from the stranger's mouth, is not the question. The question is the story itself, and whether or not it means something is not for the story to tell. Already like that sort of like mystery to it, and a sort of commentary on, you know, what is a story, what is the goal of the story, and things like that. So yeah, I know this is supposedly a tri-chapter tag, but I basically have decided for all of these books after like a few pages or even a few paragraphs. And so this is the paragraph that's making me decide that hell yeah, I like the writing style to this so much, and like the sort of topics it goes into are things that I very much enjoy. So apart from that first paragraph, let me read this one out to you. New York was an inexhaustible space, a labyrinth of endless steps, and no matter how far he walked, no matter how well he came to know its neighborhoods and streets, it always left him with a feeling of being lost. Lost not only in the city, but within himself as well. Each time he took a walk, he felt as though he were leaving himself behind, and by giving himself up to the movement of the streets, by reducing himself to a seeing eye, he was able to escape the obligation to think. And this, more than anything else, brought him a measure of peace, a salutary emptiness within. The world was outside of him, around him, before him, and the speed with which it kept changing made it impossible for him to dwell on any one thing for very long. Motion was of the essence, the act of putting one foot in front of the other and allowing himself to follow the drift of his own body. By wandering aimlessly, all places became equal, and it no longer mattered where he was. On his best walks, he was able to feel that he was nowhere. And this finally was all he ever asked of things, to be nowhere. New York was a nowhere he had built around himself, and he realized that he had no intention of ever leaving it again. So very much like that, very much like looking at like cities within literature So very much like that, very much like looking at the description of cities within literature to begin with, and I very much like this sort of like trance-like state and that feeling of solitude within a city setting, of feeling like you are alone even though you're surrounded by many people, of looking for the nowhere in a place. So yeah, I'm definitely keeping this one and rereading that one, and hopefully going back into the rest of the trilogy as well. I also think that I enjoyed it quite a lot, even though in principle it's working a little bit off of the mystery thriller genre, which I don't like, but I love the literary aspect of this one and the sort of like experimental style of this one a lot, if I remember correctly. So I am keeping this one and hoping to reread City of Glass and dive back into rest. Next up, I think I will try Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which, as far as I'm aware, is, I think it's this one that's considered one of the greatest war novels of all time. And I could be totally wrong about that, you know. Or is it more like dystopian? I don't know. We'll find out, I guess. So does this have, this does not have a explanation of what the book is about in any parts, right? No. So I guess we'll read like some of the things that authors have said about this book. Hilarious and tragic, at the heart of Catch-22 is a savage indictment of 20th century madness and the desire of the ordinary man to survive. The greatest satirical work in the English language since Erehon. Never heard of that book. Blessedly, monstrously, bloatedly, cynically funny, and fantastically unique. No one has ever written a book like this. Not only the best novel to come out of the war, but the best novel to come out of anywhere in years. Wildly original, brutally gruesome, a dazzling performance that will outrage as many readers as it delights. Vulgarly, bitterly, savagely funny, it will not be forgotten by those who can take it. And an apocalyptic masterpiece. So it seems to be about war, but perhaps also a little bit like dystopian or whatever. So it does seem to be about the war. But so let me dive into the first chapter of this one. It does, I think, also start with a preface, but I don't tend to read prefaces. So I'm going to go straight into the first chapter. Alright, so for Catch-22, I think I'm deciding to get rid of it. So I do think that there is merit in this one, and it does have some like interesting stuff happening in the first chapter. It is quite funny in places. So like I read the first passage where it's been made clear that our protagonist is kind of pretending to be sick to be able to stay into the in the hospital, because he has got quite a good life for himself there. You know, he's taken care of, and all he has to do in exchange is censor letters that are written by his fellow enlisted soldiers. So it's definitely going to be looking at things like censorship and things like that, I'm going to assume. And he has this sort of like funny, it's kind of monotonous for him to do that, so he invents like ways in which to make it more interesting for himself, like redacting certain things. Like in one of the times that he's redacting, he will redact every single article in the sentence, like un, and the, so he'll remove everything except for those, and so making the letter extremely illegible. And he's making these sort of games with himself, and so they're also and so he's making these sort of like games with himself. And so I do think that it probably would be an okay read, and maybe I would even love it if I get further into the novel, but it's also not really grabbing me because I'm not that interested into wartime stories. And so even though I've been kind of enjoying this first chapter, I'm also not loving it or anything like that, or not drawn into it neither. And so I'm gonna say I have more than enough books still on my shelf, so this one is going to go as well. Next up, I'm going to be trying Kraken by Melville. This is a Spanish version, but I don't think it's originally Spanish. I think it's originally an English language book. And so let's try to read it. So basically it says, like, I'm gonna have to translate this a little bit: an impossible robbery, a legendary beast, a holy war. I don't know, I love like octopus type creatures. They have a name, but I don't know what it is in English, or not even in Dutch. I love those creatures. I think they're so creepy, but they're also super interesting. And so I definitely think that they make for great villains. that I don't know whether that is where the story is going. So if I remember correctly, I already tried to read this once, and I think it starts with sort of like robbery in a museum or something like that. But it didn't grab my attention, so we'll see what happens this time around. Alright, rereading a few pages of this has brought me back to the reason why I didn't continue on with this one, and that is my level of Spanish. So I do have university level of Spanish. I did spend like a couple of years not doing anything with my Spanish, and at this point I basically use Spanish only in like a professional environment, and this, being that it deals with octopus and stuff like that, it deals a lot with scientific vocabulary in Spanish, which I cannot really follow. So you know, in these first passages I've definitely already been lost countless times. Not really lost, you know, I do know what is basically happening. I can follow the gist of the story, but there's a lot of words that I don't fully understand, that I can just kind of grasp are related to something scientific or like related to something that is very specific for the scientific environment in which we're following. So we're very much in a museum environment at this point, but it's also like a laboratory and things like that. So a lot of vocabulary I cannot fully understand, though I do know what it is more or less about. But so that is kind of hindering my enjoyment of the story as well. And as this is a sort of like sci-fi story, I'm definitely expecting that to take place more and more throughout this book. And so one of the things that I like about sci-fi is, you know, when you're kind of exploring the sort of like theory behind what the sci-fi element introduced. And I think that I'm already easily lost with that in English sometimes, and probably would be in Dutch as well, but in Spanish it's definitely going to be like, the language is going to be an added barrier there. So I think that I'm going to let this one go, and then maybe at some point I'll pick something up by Melville. It's like, I haven't heard too much about this author in all honesty, so I'll have to, I think I'm going to be looking into it a little bit more to see whether I want to pick it up in a different language or not. But so yeah, I'm also going to be dropping that one. And then the final one that I'm going to be going into is going to be The Wind in the Willows. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. So this is a children's classic. It's the 100th anniversary edition, and I think it's probably going to be the easiest one to read. It is relatively short. It's like 250 pages, and it's got like illustrations in there, and so it also doesn't have too much text on a single page. So it would be the easiest one to get through, but I'm still not entirely sure. I actually have no idea what the story is about, so let me see what I can find here. The wildwood seems a terrifying place to Mole until he finds that it's full of friends: kind Sleepy Badger, brave and lively Ratty, and the irresponsible Mr. Toad, famous for his wealth and his car smashes. But there are also the sinister Weasels and Stouts, and when they capture Toad Hall, the friends must fight together to save it. Interesting, because I will say that that first paragraph just made me go like, is this gonna be like a Winnie the Pooh? Because I don't really need to spend time on reading a sort of like Winnie the Pooh, like, you know, wholesome story. You know, not that there's no merit to that, but really, I don't really feel the need for that. But then there is this sort of like darker side to the story as well, and this sort of sense of coming together as a community. So who knows, I will definitely try the first chapter. Now there's also a quote on there: "The dusk advanced on him steadily, rapidly, gathering in behind and before, and the lights seemed to be draining away like floodwater." Don't know why that quote is on there. There's like no goal to that quote, you know, and it's not like such great quotes that you are instantly drawn into the story. So interesting choice for a quote, I guess. So let's dive into the story. So I think I've also decided for this one that I don't need it. You know, I think it is probably a very nice one to read when you are young, when you are a child, but I don't really have enough of an incentive to read this one. I would probably enjoy it if I do, but it's most likely not going to be like a 4 or 5 star read. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe this turns out to be like a super like heartbreaking story or anything like that, but I think I can miss it in my life, so I'm not gonna fill my shelves with this one. I'm just going to let it go. So welcome back to Future Clio. So hopefully so I hope it wasn't too much of a bother. I've really debated whether I should just make an overview of it, but you know, the entire concept behind this video is of course to kind of go through my thought process as we're going through it. So yeah, I do apologize, I'm really not that happy with this video in the end. But so the books that I ended up getting rid of were Great Short Works of Herman Melville, Catch-22, Wings of the Dove by Henry James, Kraken by China Miéville, and The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Books that I decided to keep were the New York Trilogy by Paul Austen and Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. But so yeah, all in all, this is a further reduction of 5 books for my unhaul project. So I will have the list down below of how many books that at this point in time I still have on my physical TBR. Mind you, that takes into account every single book that I've unhauled during this project, but also every book that I might have read in the month of December in the meantime. So it's not really comparison if you check out the first week statistics versus this week, for example, because in the meantime I will have read a few books. But I can also tell you I haven't really read at a huge pace in the month of December neither, so it's not gonna make such a big difference. But so yeah, hope you guys still enjoyed this one, at least in terms of, you know, the process itself. And yeah, I definitely think that I need to get a mic or something, because it's not the first time, and I don't know whether it was just that period in time, but it's not the first time that I have that whistle tone in my videos, and it's very annoying. Even I, when I'm editing it, find that super annoying, so maybe I should invest in sort of like a mic or something like that. But so yeah, hope you guys still were able to push through this, and if not, I totally understand, but then you're not seeing this. But in any case, hope you guys still enjoyed this video, and see you guys for a future one. Bye!